All right. Testing of sound. See Farsight in the house already, I see. All right. Welcome everybody. Can Hammer TV. It is November 17th and Christmas fast approaching. Oh God, that time of year again. Winter fast approaching. Time to lock down in more ways than one these days. On the upside, Ottawa seems to getting control of its COVID situation. Today we only had 11 cases. So hopefully soon, in the next couple of weeks, we may be able to start bringing games back to the channel. So, but for now, it's still as is, but the signs are good that things are turning around in the right direction. So hopefully that means we'll be able to play some games soon. And with that in mind, I have been assembling and painting another 6 Venatari. God help me, more gold, but I want to run double Venatari and see how that goes. And funny story, so I had my original box of Venatari had I used the spears, and I knew I kept the pistols and the shields around, but I had long forgotten where they were. And then so when I got my second batch of Venatari, I used their shields and pistols for my first batch of Venatari, but then I want now a second batch of Venatari and don't have shields and pistols, and I'm not going to buy a third batch of bodies just to get the weapons. So I was like, so I've been looking around for substitutes and everything, and 3D printed some stuff, and then I cleared out my entire Warhammer area here of all the AOS, and in the process of that found the original pistols and shields. So those are now going on the second batch. So funny story, but so they're getting painted right now, and hopefully by the time Bat Reps return, I'll be able to play some double Venatari action just for funsies. And so with the clearing out of a lot of my AOS, I've got more space to put my 40k, and so the Golden Boys have more space here. They've taken up 2.5 shelving units basically, so they got a bit more space to breathe now, which is nice for them. And then when all the books, these books will slowly get replaced by the new books, and been trashing a lot of old books. And I cleared the top shelf there for my larger models for display. So I've got my Thunderhawk there, and Nagash and Mastodon, some of my big AOS monsters, Knights, Castellan, stuff like that. So that's kind of on the big top shelf there. So it's kind of cool, nice to really clean out and spring cleaning, moved all my foam onto a shelf so it's all on the floor, moved the bags to the corner, so I got a lot more space to move around the table now. So when it's time to game, we will be ready. Okay, tonight is Tactica episode 43. We will be carrying on the unit deep dives, and tonight the deep dive is on Terminators. And so you cannot talk about Terminators without talking about both Terminators, Allarus and Aquilon Terminators. And so we will be doing the great debate tonight, one of the most frequently asked questions on the Discord, on Facebook groups, private messages. Should I be running Aquilon or Allarus Terminators? Well, hopefully we're going to settle that debate tonight, maybe. And I think this is important. It's important to look at all your units, but particularly when these two units are basically both very similar with slight differences, it's always important to revisit this debate whenever things change. And by things changing, I mean when points change, when rules change, or when meta changes. So, and quite recently, we've always got meta changes, but we've also had rules changes and points changes courtesy of the Forge World book. So it is the perfect timing to do this episode. And also now that we have the Forge World book, we can carry on with all of our deep dives because our rules probably won't be changing for some time. So C Farsight says, why not both? Well, don't be like Panasonic, slightly ahead of your time. We will be talking about that. So we're going to get right into it. So, the Terminators the Allarus Terminators, anyway, have been with us since the beginning. The Aquilon joined us, of course, with the Forge World beta rules. And traditionally, the Terminators have been some of our tougher units because of 4 wounds. The only unit that's actually inherently tougher than the Terminators was the bikes, because they're T6 instead of T5. But they came with the downside of cost. And so when the bike lists all went out of fashion due to the advent of knights, and even before that, people started to experiment with infantry, and Terminators are naturally, pretty tough. And it's also some of our only access to strength 8 and above, strength 10 now on the Aquilons. So we've been seeing Terminators in all sorts of lists in various forms, and so that's been kind of their history. And then with War of the Spider, Terminators came back in a huge way, mostly because there were some big buffs and stratagems to help Terminators compete. And so I've always, at that time, we definitely had the best Terminators in the game. They're still in the running now, although I think Deathwing Knights basically are Terminators with their built-in transhuman maybe takes over a little bit. But we still have some of the toughest Terminators in the game, and so it's always worth looking at them. All right. Now, more recently, there have been lists that have been trialing not playing with Terminators. So Devin runs a mostly bike list. Lots of people have been running lists without big units of Terminators. And, it's unusual, though. Most people want a unit of Terminators because they're tough. They can hit pretty hard. They have decent shooting. They have a lot of utility. So we're going to discuss all those things tonight. So what we're going to do, since this is like a face-off between the two, like Street Fighter, we're going to keep score. And after each section, so we're going to use the same headings and sections that we usually do for the deep dives. I'm going to give a score, either a 1 point for a win, 0 points for a loss, or 1-all for a tie. And at the end, we're going to see which Terminator scores the most points, just for fun. We'll see what the result ends up to. Okay, so the first thing when I talk about these guys, first of all, before we talk about any rules, is the models. Okay, so Allarus Terminators come in a box of 3 dudes, and they are GW plastic. Okay, and Aquilon Terminators come in a box of 3 dudes, and they are Forge World resin. Okay, and if you want, so this loadout is the gun and the fist. And if you want a fire pike or the claw, you need to buy the other loadout, which is a different purchase. Okay, if you want to run a fire pike and a fist and not just proxy or chop or convert, you need to buy 2 separate Aquilons just to get those 2 different weapons. Forge World, okay? Whereas these guys come with all the weapon options in one box. So there you go. In terms of model size, they are approximately the same size. The Aquilons look taller, or are taller just because of the hood. And the Aquilon are a little bit beefier, like they're wider. They look like they're bigger, but they're not actually that much bigger in actual, person. And it's worth noting, though, the biggest difference between these guys is the base. Okay, so Aquilons are 50 millimeter base, and the Allarus, like the rest of our army, is 40 millimeter base. God knows why Forge will put these guys on 50 millimeters. I even emailed them and asked them, was this for real or is this a mistake? And it is for real. They confirmed they always wanted Aquilon on 50 millimeter bases for some reason. So that is worth noting because that affects how you play them. They're a little bit harder to find spots to deep strike, fit people into cover and runes and things like that. So keep that in mind. The base size does affect your gameplay. It's easier to take up more space with them because they're larger. In the old days of trapping, it was easier to trap them and things like that. So, the bigger base size does come into play over the course of games. Okay. Personally, I just find this base size too large and annoying, but it is what it is. In fact, the annoying factor has been taken over by the Agamatis stupid bike bases, so I don't find these guys as annoying anymore, but yeah, it is annoying. Okay. The final thing to keep in mind, though, of course, is these guys are Forge World. So there are still dark, unenlightened areas of the world where people play and are not allowed to play Forge World. So keep that in mind if you play in any such areas that you may not be able to use these guys. Okay? But come on, even the ETC, now called the WTC, allows Forge World now. There's really no reason to not allow Forge World, especially now with GW writing this consolidated one book. I think there's literally no reason not to allow Forge World anymore. Not that there was too much before, but... Okay. Okay, so now we'll go on with the normal deep dive with those things in mind. Okay, so the first section is, of course, role and keywords. So these guys are both elite slots, which is fine. I think they're supposed to be elites, and they fit in the elite slots. Arguably, the Vexilla should be an HQ, and Sisters and things should be troops. But anyway, that's a different issue. They're elites, and that's how it is. Of course, this does mean that if you're running more than one Terminator unit and a Vexilla, you're either doing a battalion or a double patrol or a vanguard. So you use up your elite slots very quickly if you're aiming to run Terminators and a Vexilla, which a lot of people are. So that kind of is one of the big things that determines a lot of our list building. So, and that affects the rest of your list, right? So if you're running 2 Terminator units and a Vexilla, now you're running a battalion or double patrol, and so you're running more HQs and more troop slots than maybe you'd wanted to, because you got to fill those slots. Okay, keyword wise, so they're both infantry keywords. As always, a great keyword to have in terms of interaction with terrain. Tanglefoot, of course, I'm going to mention Tanglefoot all the time. And then doing actions and secondaries like that. So they're both infantry, which is fine. They both have Terminator keyword, and that means nothing. Basically, it meant nothing until War of the Spider came out and gave them a bunch of stratagems that was based off the Terminator keyword. But until War of the Spider came out, their Terminator meant nothing different to them. They also have keywords Allarus Custodian for the Allarus and Aquilon Custodian for the Aquilon. So this still means that the Allarus have access to some exclusive Allarus-only strats, which we will cover later, whereas the Aquilon keyword at this time means nothing. And the Aquilon got core, and Allarus, we assume, will be core as well. So no problem, they all both got core. Okay, so in terms of keyword, we're keeping score now. I have to give this one to the Allarus. They're 1-0 on score here because they have a keyword that gives them exclusive stratagems, and Aquilon keyword means nothing. So first blood to the Allarus Terminators for having a special keyword. So 1-0 for the Allarus. Okay. So we'll go on to statistics. Statistics, their stats. They have very standard custodian stats as usual. Won't go over them again, except that they have an extra wound, so they have 4 wounds each. They have an extra attack, so they have 4 attacks each. And that's about it. They have 2 up, 4 up like everyone else. And their ballistic skill, everything else is exactly the same. Welcome, Jason C. What's up? So, we pay a premium for our Terminator keyword, basically, because the difference between our Terminators and our non-Terminators is pretty small for the premium that we pay compared to, say, other factions, like Marines, for example. And now the difference between their Terminators and our Terminators is also getting a lot smaller thanks to recent changes. And so we're paying extra premium on top of their Terminators, and the gap between the two types of Terminators is closing. So hopefully that gap will change with the book, but the Aquilons did not change. On one hand, though, I feel like they couldn't make Aquilons 5 wounds all of a sudden and leave Allarus at 4, because then nobody would play Allarus. So I can understand why that didn't change with this Forge World book. And that might be FAQ'd later when our book comes out. If Allarus got more wounds, then Aquilon also get more wounds. I don't know. But I can see why they would not necessarily change the wounds right now. So the other thing about their statistic that's different from other factions Terminators is that they move 6 inches, and that is still a thing. I think we have the fastest Terminators in the game, and people still give us salty looks when they learn that our Terminators move 6 inches when theirs only move 4 or 5. So that is still a thing. Also, Mr. Funktastic pointed out that their leadership is 9, whereas the Guardians, I believe, are 8, but lots of other units are 9 as well. So there's a little thing there too. So still, the premium we pay over and above the new style Terminators in other books is a little bit high, so maybe we see that adjusted in the future. Okay, so basically though, their stats are exactly the same, Allarus and Aquilon. So this scoring is a tie, 1-1 Allarus and Aquilon here, because they basically exactly the same. Okay, let's move on to shooting. So the shooting, they actually are quite a lot of options. This is probably the first unit we've talked about in the deep dives that has options in terms of shooting. And so we're going to go over them. So the Allarus weapon option is basically an axe or a spear. And in terms of shooting, they're both the same. And they're the same as the axe and spears from Wardens and Guardians. So I'm not going to spend too much time on those. They do have a special gun, their fist-mounted ballistic grenade launcher, which is actually a D3 shot, strength 4, minus 3 AP, 1 damage at 12-inch range. So it's a short-range grenade launcher. And most importantly, it is blast by virtue of being D3. And so that's actually pretty important because the grenade launcher actually becomes quite good for killing Horde because you're getting auto 3 shots for each grenade launcher in a unit of 5 guys. That's 15 shots straight up. And those kind of stats put down Hordes. Strength 4, usually Hordes are T3. Minus 3 AP usually takes any kind of save that Horde units tend to have. Even in cover. So guardsmen in cover still minus 3, they're gone. And 1 damage, usually these guys are just 1 damage. So, the ballistic grenade launcher is actually a pretty good Horde weapon. Killing 15 dudes and then killing another, 8 to 10 dudes with rapid firing spears or axes, that's like, 20, 25 dudes that 5 dudes is killing, which is pretty good. That's pretty nice firepower for Hordes. Now, the superior fire pattern stratagem works on the axes and spears only because they're rapid fire, and it's not super great. It's probably most useful if you're in rapid fire range. If you're not in rapid fire range, all you're doing is spending CP to give them rapid fire. Doesn't seem like it's very worth it with only 5 guys. But if you're in rapid fire range, you've turned 10 shots into 20 shots, so that may be worth doing depending on what you're shooting at. But certainly usable in a pinch with the axes and the spears. Now, we're going to talk about it later when we talk about the stratagem for sniping that the Allarus have, but sniping really with the Allarus is the most effective inside 12 inches, so you can throw the grenades too, and so you could rapid fire the axes. I have been very, very unimpressed with sniping outside the 12-inch range, so you can't shoot the grenades at them, and you only have 1 shot on the spears or axes. And you definitely don't want to spend an extra CP for spear fire patterns just to make your sniping more effective. So, 3 CP for that is just not worth it. So the sniping itself is best kept to within rapid fire range for maximum effect. And we'll talk more about the sniping thing later on when we talk about strats. And that's it. So Allarus don't have too much flexibility in their shooting. They just have the axes or spears, which are the same, and they have the grenade launcher, which is a nice little buff sometimes. Sometimes when you got a multi-wound models that you just need 1 wound off here or there, then always remember, like, your axes and spears shoot for 2 damage and your grenade launchers shoot for 1 damage, and you can decide what you want to shoot first. So I think you always watch out when you against like 3 wound models or whatever. If you got 1 wound left, shoot the grenades first. Do that smart so you don't waste damage from the 2 damage axe and spears. Okay. So Aquilon have a few shooting options, and up until recently, the real only shooting option was the Lastrum bolters. But now they got a couple of decent shooting options coming into the mix thanks to the Forge World update. So they have actually quite a lot of flexibility. So first of all, the Lastrum bolters are still great. These are basically free with the cost of the model, and they're rapid fire 24-inch rapid fire 2, so 4 shots in rapid fire range, which is great. So they're like storm bolters, but at strength 5 -1 damage. So by any stretch of the imagination, that's a nice profile. Maybe you feel a little bit left out now that heavy bolters are 2 damage, but some people are salty that Lastrum in general didn't get a buff to 2 damage, whatever, but it's still a nice profile due to volume of shots. So 5 dudes in rapid fire range is putting out 20 shots. That's pretty good. And then if you spend superior fire patterns on these guys, that's 40 shots from 5 guys. Okay, and these shots will take out hordes no problem. Strength 5 -1 damage will take out all sorts of hordes. And so that is a nice amount of firepower. If you really want to put a dent in something tougher, you can definitely just shoot 40 shots at something. I mean, I shot 40 shots at Voldus once and barely took him out. But so you can definitely still do that. Although, it's not just a horde weapon. It's actually pretty good at killing things. And I think people mathed it out to like 4 or 5 intercessors or something with that number of shots. So the Lastrum bolters are still good. You're taking out 30, 35 orc boys pretty easily with these guys, especially with Trajan around. And strength 5 is really good even against the T4 hordes like orc boys. So these guys are good. And then especially if you're dropping down with a Homer or something, you can get easily into rapid fire range. And then superior fire patterns on the Lastrum guns is still really good. Okay. The next gun that has gotten renewed life because Aquilon's got cheaper is, of course, the Adrathic. And the Adrathic got new life, first of all, because Aquilon are cheaper. So by virtue, the gun is kind of cheaper. And also that the meta is changing and is now looking like there's going to be a lot of 3-wound T5 models. And you don't want to... you can do some damage with your Lastrum guys against T5 3-wound models, but Adrathic just seems better suited to that. Now you get less shots, so only 2 shots each guy, but they are assault, so you can be more mobile, advance, and still shoot. But this strength 5 against T5 obviously is not super good, but sometimes people use transhuman and stuff. But wound on force is not great. And then -3, which is great, and flat 3 damage. Every wound that goes through takes a guy out. So I think that the Adrathic definitely has a role in the current meta and has become more reasonably priced. It could do with a few more shots or for being strength 6 like the Dick Bikes, but there's definitely a role for them and something worth trying out. So the Adrathic guns. Okay, next is the Fire Pike. Unfortunately, the Fire Pike still sucks. It sucked before, and there's even less reason to take it now that the Adrathic has kind of come down in price. Unfortunately, strength 6 on strength 5 is not a huge difference. It is better, granted, against T5 bodies to be strength 6, but this thing is just AP 1 and 1 damage, and the auto hitting makes no difference really with our guys hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, and then I'd rather have straight 4 or 8 shots rather than roll a D6 and get a 1 or a 2. So, and the Fire Pike still costs you points. The reason people used to argue for Fire Pikes was to hit flyers. Of course, there's no hit stack minus to hit stacking anymore, so that reason is gone. And Overwatch, of course, I can't remember the last time I Overwatched now or somebody Overwatched against me. So I'm sorry, there's no reason to take the Fire Pike. You don't need them right now. They are just not good, and they did not get any... They got Flamer buff to longer range, which really doesn't matter because they were already pretty good range already for Flamer, so... No, I'm sorry. No reason to take Fire Pikes right now. So overall, you're taking either Lastrum or Adrathic, and I think you decide that purely if points is an issue or what other shooting do you have in your army. So a lot of times, if you're taking Venatari, you're going to be spending your superior fire patterns on the Venatari, so maybe your Lastrum will not be as efficient as you'd hoped. Maybe if you're playing a lot of hordes and demons and nurglings and sisters, then you may want to run the Lastrum because that will take care of a whole bunch of sisters. And if you're running against a lot of Marines and Gravis armor, maybe you want to try the Adrathic. So I think that's really a meta decision and what other shooting you have in your army, which gun you take. So if we are talking scoring now for shooting, Allarus versus Aquilon, I'm going to give the win to the Aquilon on this one, thanks mostly to the new rules with the cheaper ability to get Adrathic and with the way the meta is going right now. And the sniping is nice, but it's situational. Everything has to kind of line up to make it good. It costs you 2 CP. So I think that the Aquilon win out on flexibility and shooting here. And so I'm going to give Aquilon the win on. Okay, so now we move to melee. All right, so melee is where we really want to put our attention because generally we want these Terminators to go hitting things. And so melee-wise, let's look at these units. So the Allarus have the axe or the spear, and we've already had the axe-spear debate in the Warden episode. Basically, in short, spending a CP on either for their various stratagems, either +1 to wound or -1 AP. The only real difference is the breaking points of T5 and T7. And so the biggest issue with axes and spears right now is D3 damage. And so that is just a breaking point for them. And so, yes, I know that D3 can spike 5s and 6s, and that's really great when it happens. Unfortunately, it just seems like it happens way less commonly than those things fluffing 1s and 2s all the time. And it's a thing, the D3, and it's just a thing. And there's nobody who could argue that they would rather less variability and spiking up or down in place of reliable flat damage. It's not even arguable. And so, that's the bad thing about the Allarus Terminators. So let's look on Aquilon. Aquilon, of course, have 2 melee options. Okay, so the point was brought up about -1 damage, half damage. So -1 damage, yeah, sure, that sucks if you're flat 2. It also sucks if you're D3 most of the time. And also, that's only on Dreadnoughts for Marines. So there's not a lot of -1 damage across the rest of the armies and factions. So if it becomes a more prevalent thing, then yeah, maybe. But in almost every situation, flat 2 all the way. Okay, so Aquilons have talons and fists. Okay, let's talk about the talons first, because it's just not a very useful weapon. So this weapon, typical talon, so you get an extra attack if you run a talon. So even across a 5-man unit, that's still only 5 extra attacks in a unit that's already throwing out 20 attacks. So, and then it's strength 6 versus strength 10. You get to reroll a wound, which you generally don't need to do that much with Trajan around, and you have strength 10 anyway, and you're doing 1 damage. So yeah, I just don't see a world where you would rather have the talons than have the fists. Even for the extra 5 attacks, I'd rather pulverize those 20 than maybe semi-kill 25 times. So it just, there's not a world where I see that you would take the talons over the fists. Unless like the talons got buffed in some way, either better damage, or maybe you got 2 extra attacks, or like 2 attacks per attack, like some armies get. So I don't know, just giving you 1 extra attack at the worst profile, it just doesn't seem worth it. Now the fists is the money. The fist is why people started taking Aquilons, okay? Strength 10. So strength 10 wounds everything at least on 3s, many things on 2s. T5 wounding on 2s in the current T5 3 wound meta, super great. Now you can argue, well, they're just going to transhuman. Well, sure, but they're going to transhuman everything, so that's kind of a moot argument, and eventually it'll run out of CP. but wounding things on 2s when they're T5 is so good. And the other thing, -4 AP, amazing. There's a lot of things out there right now with 2-up or 1-up saves and no invulns. So -4 is the bomb. If you -4 is so good, and a lot of things don't even get saves with that because many things don't have invulns in combat. So -4 AP is so good, and then flat 2, as we already discussed, way better than D3 almost all the time. So yeah. We talked about the Dreadnought thing about -1 damage. And you know what? If you're fighting a Dreadnought who's got -1 damage, even a Telemon, a unit of 5 Aquilon will still kill that thing doing 1 damage a hit because they just do so many attacks. And Strength 10 is the wound baby. So, it still kills like your average Marine Dreadnought even with the -1 damage. Just from the number of attacks. Okay. Against anything T8 or 9, there's not a lot of things that are T9, Mastodon being one, but Strength 10 is just better. It's just better than Strength 8. There's no argument about that. It's just better. And then now you can use Slayer of Nightmares. That makes you now wound on 2s, whereas the Slayer of Nightmares just makes you wound on 3s with the Strength 8. So the Strength 10 is just the bomb. Okay, so when we come to scoring melee output, we have to give that win to the Aquilon Terminators again. And, just talking about the things we just talked about, flat 2 damage, strength 10, -4 AP, same number of attacks, they're just better. And so if we're just talking anecdotal play experience now, I have used Allarus Terminators a lot. I have used Aquilon Terminators a lot. And when I needed to kill something, the Aquilons always did it. The Allarus, not frequently, but noticeably could fluff. There's that fear in your stomach that these guys could fluff. 3 guys doing like 4 damage and stupid shit like that. Like happens all the time with the crappiness of D3, And especially these days with minuses to hit in combat, transhumans coming in. Every wound you get through, you need to make it hurt. And just the D3 really makes that feel extra bad. And so just anecdotally, Aquilons get it done, and Allarus sometimes don't. And so this win goes to the Aquilon in terms of melee potential. Okay, abilities and rules is the next section. So in terms of abilities, so they're both Terminator units, so they both have native Deep Strike, which, as I've said many times before, is an awesome thing because of flexibility. Okay, you don't necessarily Deep Strike because you can Deep Strike, but it gives you that flexibility. And so we are seeing actually a lot of people start their stuff on the table these days, which is great. You don't always have to Deep Strike, but having the ability to Deep Strike is great. So, and they both have that. Now the Allarus, after that, the Aquilon have no more special abilities. The Allarus have a special ability. It's called Slayer of Tyrants. And this gives them the ability to move combat moves, so pile-ins and consolidations, towards the nearest character instead of the nearest model. Now, if you're running a unit of 6 or more guys, this gets hampered by coherency rules quite a bit, actually. So if you're running larger units at Allarus, you're probably not making full advantage of your Slayer of Tyrants ability. But in 5-mans or less, this ability can still be extremely powerful because that's 6 inches of movement that you can now have in often many directions. I've done Tactica episodes in the past. If you check out, go back in the playlist on how to use the Allarus's abilities, and to almost full extent that those abilities are still intact in 9th. And so maybe the only difference now with the Slayer of Tyrants is you're probably not using it as much to pull off wraps, because wrapping is not really a thing anymore. But you can definitely still use it to bad touch things, bad touch characters, or get onto objectives during combat. Often your opponent's combat, ruining all their plans because your guys are OPSEC. So I think Slayer of Tyrants is still an amazing ability, and I feel like most people don't use it very well, even if they're using the Allarus. And so it's still a big plus for the Allarus Terminators. So, in terms of abilities and rules, the Allarus get the win on this one because they have Slayer of Tyrants and Aquilon have nothing. So, the Allarus win this fight. Okay, points. Okay. So, points. So, current pointing, Allarus with spears are 65 points each. That's 325 points for 5. Allarus with axes are 70 points each, so that's 350 for 5. Aquilon with lastrum and fists are 75 points each, so 375 for 5. And Aquilons with Adrathic and fists are 85 points each, or 425 for 5. So it's a pretty significant points difference now. We're talking between the cheapest, which is Allarus with spears at 65 points each, and the Adrathic with the fist, which is 85 points each. That's a 20-point spread between two extremely similar units. And so that's not insignificant. Across the course of a 5-man unit, that's a 100-point difference. So, that's not a negligible amount of points. It's maybe more negligible in a Custodes army than in other armies, but it's still a decent chunk of points. It's almost like a Vexilla or a captain on foot. And so the point difference between the standard Allarus with the axe, I think that's still mostly the standard way of running Allarus, with the lastrum and fist, so the kind of traditional Aquilon, is now only 5 points though. So on one hand, you have this large 20-point gap between these two loadouts, but then now the two more commonly run loadouts are so close together that they're almost the same. And that was the result of the Forge World rules. So now you have these two units that's really only 25-point difference in a unit of 5 between those two. And that's where the compelling arguments now come in between Allarus and Aquilon, right? Because the difference in points is so small. When the difference in points was 10 points, that's still a 50-point difference between the two units, and that seems psychologically anyway to be much more. Now it's like so close. 25 points in a Custodes list is like nothing. It's like that's just like a bunch of daggers. It's like so close between the two now. So now if you thought that the Aquilon were too expensive before, you got to think again. It's very close. Okay. Now if you're talking about running the Aquilon with the Adrathics now we're talking about a 15-point spread between Axe Allarus and Adrathic Aquilon, and so that's 75 points difference. So now you're getting kind of halfway back up to the 100-point difference. So that's a little bit more of a thought exercise. You have to put more thought then into whether you want that Adrathic or not, but it's still compelling. And it's worth noting that the points are constantly dropping on our Terminators. The Allarus Terminators were one of the few units in the game that's points came down with 9th. And so they're 65 points now. So, if we see, and as I mentioned, that gap in terms of stats between normal Terminators and other factions and our Terminators is shrinking. So maybe we're going to see that point gap shrink as well in future publications. Who knows, but that will certainly be good. The other thing is, as our Terminators get cheaper, our bikers, they get a little bit cheaper, but not really. They've never broken the 95 point mark. So now the difference in points between our Terminators and our bikes is getting larger. And that's significant. A base biker right now is still 95 points. So now you have a growing gap between Terminators and bikes. That makes that decision a little bit trickier as well. Okay. So all of these 5-man units come in under 500. I mean, a Allarus unit with spears is with spears is only 325. That's only a little bit more than a Venatari unit. And Aquilon with Adrathic and Fist is 425. So that's like another half a Venatari unit. So, and Venatari are so good right now, so people are really weighing their choices in terms of how cost efficient the Venatari are versus the Terminators. So that's one of the things that people have been starting to think about with their points. Still, at almost 500 points, a unit of 5 Terminators is like almost 25% of your army. And so people are starting to question, do they do enough to take up a quarter of your army? And I think previous to the Forge World book, the answer was probably, maybe, maybe. But now that Venatari got so good, and there's a Drathic bikes and Dreadnoughts are better, is like maybe slightly less than before. Starting to look expensive, even in Custodes terms. So, the points is constantly changing. We have to evaluate it all the time. But as it stands right now, that's kind of where the point stands with the Terminators. I feel our Terminators are overcosted compared to the new style Terminators now, for sure. I don't think anyone can argue that. How much more they drop, I don't know. And then if they do drop, let's say they drop another 5 points each. So now we're talking like 60 and, like 70. And then bikes now are almost 30 points more. Now that's a big gap now. Now you're talking about different levels of things. And, when I start plugging in bikes into my lists now and I look at the points they cost, I'm like, whoa, those things are really expensive now as our Terminators get cheaper. But then you look at Terminators and Space Marine factions, you're like, man, their Terminators are freaking cheap. So it's like, okay, now we got to think. I think we're going to talk about when we talk about comparables. Actually, that's next. So we'll go on to that. Okay, so scoring in the points. I'm going to give this a tie. The Allarus and Aquilon tie on points. I think you can't just give this win to the Allarus because they're cheaper. I think there's more to points than just the absolute number. And so I would still take a unit of, Lash and Fist over Axelaris for 25 points more. That's the argument now. Do you take them for only 25 points more? What's that? Like a bunch of daggers? Like, maybe, probably. I don't know. That's a decision you got to make. But that gap between the two types of Terminators is closed. And then now that's a real discussion. And as Devin mentioned on our other Tactica, having a true choice, not just based on crazy points one side or crazy stats on another, but a true choice between two units is actually a great place to be. Okay. So the other thing to consider, though, is if you really, really want a Terminator unit, but you just don't have the points, then Spear Allarus at 325 is pretty reasonable. That's a pretty reasonable take. So you got to think about that too. They give you a lot of utility, shooting, and melee combat for only 325. Only 325. So that's definitely something to think about. Okay. So that one's a tie. Okay, so the next section is comparables. And I didn't score this section, but comparables, there's not actually a lot of comparables, strict comparables, if you think about it. 4 wounds, T5, 4 wounds, 2 up, 4 up. There's actually not a lot of comparables. We always compare our Terminators to other Terminators, but is that a fair comparison? It definitely wasn't before, and maybe it's slightly more of a fair comparison now, but it's even just the stats are different, right? Centurions kind of would be like the closest. Centurions have 4 wounds now, 2 up save. They generally don't have invulns. They have pretty good shooting and obviously good combat, and they have a lot of stacked rules on top of them. Less now than they used to, but that would be the closest comparable, and they are a lot cheaper. So, but to be fair, I think what you need to start comparing is maybe not just things that have the same wounds or things that have the same points, but start comparing things that maybe have the same role, or things that comparing what your unit's going to do against a similar unit that has the same sort of role. So, for example, can you compare Allarus or Aquilons to like a unit of 6 Blade Guard vets? Well, I think you can, actually. Those guys are cheaper. They also have 2 up, 4 up. They do a lot more attacks than we do. They have flat damage. They have OBSEC now. They can turn off your OBSEC. Blade Guard vets are crazy. And so I think it's very fair to compare those two, even though they're not technically Terminators or anything like that. And, if you put those two units against each other, that's a crapshoot. Same with things like heavy intercessors, maybe less of a comparison in terms of combat, but and probably shooting, but similar kind of stats. And then of course we got to compare to our comrades in the First Legion, Deathwing Knights. So 2 up, 4 up, a lot of damage, okay shooting, maybe not as good shooting, and now auto transhuman. And and 3 wounds now. So, and a lot cheaper. So, these are the comparisons that our Terminators are looking at these days. And it's looking, that gap definitely looking a lot smaller than it used to be. Yeah, so even just assault Terminators, getting more wounds now, storm shields everywhere, giving everyone 2-up, 4-up. So, and then they've got thunder hammers and things like that. Like, that comparison is getting tough for our boys with their D3 spears and axes, I gotta tell you. Okay. And that goes back to the original point, like the points difference between those kind of units and our kind of units, just because we pay a Terminator premium, it seems like it's a bit high. Okay, stratagems. So this is a big section on stratagems. We're going to go over stratagems that people will commonly use on these units, and then we're going to score it. Okay, so Grim Responsibility. So Grim Responsibility is such a good strat. I wish it was -1 to wound, and it's less useful on T5 than it is on T6, so it's way better on bikes than it is on all our foot troops. But it still can be useful, especially if we start seeing things like heavy bolter spam coming back on like ATVs and shit like that, or attack bikes and stuff. So I think, Grim Responsibility is still a really good strat even on T5. So Golden Light and Merades, obviously, if you're deep striking them and you're running Dread Host, you're probably going to be using Homer or Golden Light to bring your guys down, so that's a no-brainer. Eagle's Strike. So Eagle's Strike is an interesting one. That's the one where you get your opponent. If you Solar Watch guy kills a character, then your opponent has to pay 1 CP extra for the next stratagem they use. And so if you happen to be playing Terminators who are Solar Watch and they manage to kill a character, like Allarus could snipe a character, or you kill a character sometime later in the game, and then sure, you could force your opponent to pay 1 extra CP, and maybe that stops them using that stratagem, especially later in the game. It's a kind of super situational kind of thing, but I guess you're not taking Solar Watch because of the stratagem. So, it's like a little bonus. Okay, Tanglefoot, obviously, Tanglefoot for days. Ever Vigilant. So, don't forget our Interceptor strat, Ever Vigilant. It is 2 CP, which kind of sucks, but it does allow you to throw out all that firepower we were talking about on the drop. And now you can't fear fire patterns because this is technically the movement phase, but you could still throw out 20 last round bolter shots. And so it depends on what's coming down. You should consider interceptoring if appropriate. Okay, Teleport Homer, obviously, don't need to talk about Teleport Homer. Just watch out for those Aquilon base sizes. They're surprisingly large, okay? All right, Piercing Strike and Castellan Strike are the 2 strats that you're basically wanting to use almost all the time, 80% of the time when you're using Allarus. If you're using it with spears, you're going to use +1 to wound a lot. If you're using axes, it's really a lot of situations where you want to use the extra AP strat. And so you got to put some CP into your mind to use for those strats to increase the spear and axe efficiency. Otherwise, the weapons are not super efficient. So, -2 AP now on a 2-up or a 1-up guy just brings them to a 3-up or a 4-up, which is not good. And that's where you run into the crazy variants. And then you throw D3 on top of that. It's just not good. So, you need to save the CP for those stratagems if you want to make the best use out of those things. Okay, Avenge the Fallen, Indomitable Guardians, always useful strats for these guys, and really can help swing combats or late game shenanigans, give you some extra movement in terms of interrupts and stuff like that. Super good stratagems. Okay, Arcane Genetic Alchemy, which is our transhuman, obviously good way of protecting Terminators, and hopefully will get cheaper with the new book, but it is what it is for now, but good strat, obviously. Slayer of Nightmares is a great strat for +1 to wound. I just wish it was 1 CP. Like, why is that 2 CP? We have armies out there who get +1 to wound as like an army-wide free rule, and we have to pay 2 CP for it, and only against targets that are tougher than us. I don't understand why, but it is what it is. I feel like you really need a good reason to use this for 2CP, probably on axes against knights, I think, or against other T8. I think that would be the main situation you would find yourself using Slayer of Nightmares. So, I just think 2CP is too much for this strat, but, it is there. Superior fire patterns. So we just talked about superior fire patterns a lot already. This is a great strat for 1CP. And, it works on almost all the shooting that the Terminators can throw out, although you may find if you're running Venatari that you're saving it for them. So you got to keep that in mind. If you're thinking about, oh, this weapon's so good with superior fire patterns, but then you never end up using it on that unit, then that's kind of a bad justification for taking it. Emperor's Old Spice, obviously a gravy stratagem for keeping your Terminators alive. Blood Games Veterans. So I think people overlook Blood Games Veterans. I think Blood Games Veterans is a good reason never to run more than 5 man in any unit that we have. Because you don't want to pay 2 CP for that one extra dude to auto wound on 6s. But for 1 CP, if you're putting out a lot of shots, then BGV is good. I think if Lastrum, if you're shooting at stuff tougher than you with Lastrum and your superior fire patterns in it, consider putting that one extra CP to auto wound on 6s. I think Adrathics benefit from this because they're only strength 5. And I think the Allarus Terminators benefit less because they have less volume of shooting. But, it's a consideration. So don't forget Blood Games Veterans. It's a great stratagem. Now, again, probably Venatari still remain the best target for this. But, I think it can be used on Terminators quite nicely. Okay, so Auramite and Adamantium obviously are bread and butter defensive strat for Terminators, turning AP 1 and 2 to AP 0. So I think that's amazing, and you should be using it all the time when available. And you got to math it out in your head. Which one's better? Should I transhuman them? Should I AAA? Should I Old Spice? Should I use 1 or 2 or more of these? I mean, you really have to do the math in your head when you're deciding what stratagems to use. But often just getting rid of the AP is enough with the 2-up save. Okay, Fraternity of Heroes. So don't forget this nifty little strat. Not many people run Champion of the Imperium anymore, and foot-based infantry guys love being able to heroically intervene, especially Allarus if you get to do some pile-in and consolidate shenanigans. But basically a heroic intervention, a fight, a consolidate, and a pile-in, that's 9 inches of extra movement. You can bait your opponents to try and leave or sit on the edge of an objective, but if you're still within 3, you can do your HI. So I think Fraternity of Heroes is a great stratagem, so don't forget it. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the Allarus only stratagems. So Allarus are super special. They get stratagems that specifically go for Allarus only. So here we go. Unleash the Lions. Okay, I could probably do a whole episode on Unleash. I did do a Tactica on Unleash the Lions some time ago. If you go back in the playlist, there was an episode on Allarus, and we talked about Slayer of Tyrants and Unleash the Lions. So go check that out. Basically, this strat is way more useful in 9th now than it was ever useful in 8th, especially playing ITC. You give up kill more. It was not a good thing to use in ITC. But now in 9th, with emphasis on board control and holding objectives, and kill more not usually being a thing, Unleash the Lions has seen new life. I wish it wasn't 2CP, but I can understand why they make it 2CP. But it's still a very specialized situational stratagem that to use well, you need to plan in advance that you're going to do it. And I think if you can do that, this can turn games or win you games. However, where I often find people using it is in situations of desperation when they just need some more bodies to sit on objectives. And maybe that works and gets them a one primary point or a secondary here or there, but generally it's a bad move. And in those situations, your opponent usually has plenty of firepower to pick off your guys individually now. You've now made them indefendable with stratagems, and you stopped screening your characters. People always forget about that. You split your unit, they don't screen your character anymore. And so, in fact, spending 2 CP on Unleash is a very bad thing to do. So I think if you think about it carefully and you plan it ahead, you pre-plan your Unleash, this can be extremely good. Okay, very powerful stratagem. But if you just use it willy-nilly as a desperation move or just pops into your head and you think it'd be cool, it's probably not going to end up that great for you. I got to tell you, there's a lot of armies these days that have no trouble killing one Allarus Terminator, and it doesn't cause them to have any kind of target priority problem. And so you got to use this very carefully. All right? Okay. The next stratagem they get for free is Inescapable Vengeance, which of course is their sniper strat. So again, 2 CP, your unit can shoot characters. And so at first this is like, whoa, that's awesome. We'll just snipe everybody. We got axes and grenade launchers. But if you've used this enough, you will realize that it is quite lackluster over 12 inches away, as I already said. So if you're within 12 and you can put your grenades and rapid fire, your axes or spears onto the character or characters, then you're probably going to enjoy your 2 CP spent here. If not, you're going to think it was a big waste of time, and it often is. And so you really got to use it carefully. Now, the other thing about it is that people know about this trick now, and a good player who knows that the Allarus can do this, I have not found a player who falls for that, unless they did it on purpose because they really needed something and they still got that benefit knowing that their character will die the next turn. That happens too. And so that's another thing. Now, sometimes you can catch players off, especially if they forget, because you can homer in and now you're actually 6 inches closer than they thought that you would be. And so you're well within your 12 inches to snipe characters. And that's cool if you can get that to happen. The other thing is there is a new range. So the previous characters that people like to snipe, so, commanders, Vexator Mask guy, more recently the Judiciar, although he got a bit nerfed, things like that. These guys who have to be close to the front line to give their buffs or to do their effect, those were prime snipe candidates. And now we have another prime snipe candidate who may in and of himself mean that we want to run Allarus just for this eventuality, and that is the ridiculous Chief Apothecary. And that guy has to be fairly close to do his healing and rezzing, and so who knows? It may become a meta thing where we all running Allarus Terminators with 2 CP in our back pocket to snipe out this freaking Apothecary, which is ridiculously underpriced and very powerful. But that's the thing. So who knows? It's another very situational but very good strat if you can use it well. Okay, the final strat that Allarus get is concussion grenades. So concussion grenades basically, it has 2 functions. First of all, it stops. So it works only on enemy infantry. So people forget it's just infantry, and it gives them -1 to hit in combat, which for 1 CP is probably already very good. I mean, people are already talking about using sisters or trying to get Alea into their list so that they can use their -1 to hit in -1 to hit anywhere, but specifically in combat stratagem, because it's very good. -1 to hit in combat is very good, and that's only 1 CP. The other part of it is stops the opponent overwatching. People don't overwatch anymore, so that part of the strat is just a throwaway. But still, -1 CP to stop a hardcore combat unit hitting you as hard with -1 to hit is very good. And so I think the concussion grenade really has that utility. And remember, you can split you only have to hit to cause this effect. You don't have to do damage. So you can actually hit, 5 units with 5 Terminators and make them all -1 to hit in combat. So that's actually a super cool use for the concussion grenade. You just concuss everybody. And so that's cool. So that's another situational but very cool stratagem. Okay. So if we have to give a score on stratagems, Allarus wins, obviously, over Aquilon because they have all the things that Aquilon have, and Aquilon have nothing special, and Allarus have 3 situational but extremely powerful stratagems that, if used well, can have great effect. So the Allarus win this fight in the stratagem arena. Now, that doesn't mean, like, some of the strategies we talked about are better used on Aquilon than Allarus. But just overall, because of these extra stratagems, I think it pulls the Allarus ahead. Okay. Didn't get a drink. Okay. Okay, so now the next section is lists. So how are people running Terminators in lists? The most common way by far that people have been running Terminators for the longest time, and still up to this day, is as a hammer unit. And so the function of the hammer unit is to hit the enemy hard the first time, hopefully hitting first, and to survive the retribution, which in the old days was more difficult, now is a little bit easier, although maybe it's getting more difficult again, and then keep going and drive in deep to the enemy zone. And this was traditionally done from deep strike with a Homer strat, but now we have way more options. We have the Golden Light, and we also have, because of Ninth and the way Ninth is in a smaller board, we're finding effectiveness in being on the table as well. So, and then that allows them to also project an area of threat and a bit of forward force. So, but the function is still the same. They tend to be the hammer units. So how would you run a hammer? Well, the average hammer is, say, 5 to 6 models. 5 is usually plenty and avoids any coherency issues, blast issues, things like that. It's not really a huge deal, but, it's a consideration. Allarus, of course, can go up to 10-man, which is probably too many unless you intend to split that unit or you have a particular function for 10 Terminators. It'd be cool if we could run 10 and then combat squad, but and then 10-man, you're really talking functionally on the board, acting like more 7-8-man because of coherency, and you got to really then be careful about where you pull your casualties. So I don't see a huge benefit in running super large units like that, but it is possible, whereas Aquilon can only go up to 6. There's generally not a lot of reason to run 6 Aquilon over 5 Aquilon for the previously mentioned disadvantages and not a lot of advantage. So generally, I think, and 6 of those 50 millimeter bases are quite difficult to play with. So I think a unit of 4 or 5 Aquilon is fine. And Allarus, you're talking probably a minimum of 5 or 6 guys in a hammer unit. And I think that this is still probably the best way of running Terminators as a hammer. You invest that, 300, 400 points of your army into a unit that is fairly tough. You can defend, can hold space, projects force, decent shooting, decent melee ability. So I think that still is how you run the Terminators the best. I wrote here stuff about Unleash the Lions, but we already talked about that. And we talked about sniping as well. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure why I wrote it in there again. Okay, another way you can run actually Terminators is as a smaller unit, maybe like 3 dudes. 3 is the minimum, but 3 or 4 dudes. Allarus specifically, because you want the smaller base size for this function. And as 3 guys, and I played a few games with like a 3-man Allarus unit as like a backup mini hammer or as a unit that sweeps around the back. You don't feel too bad about leaving just 3 guys sweeping up your own backfield, or as a deep strike enemy zone deep strike unit that can get you things like line breaker or start to keep the enemy honest about screening, or can just get into the back and start going around their backfield. So that's an interesting kind of more subtle way of using a small unit of Terminators. And in this case, I would say Allarus for sure because of smaller base size. And they're tough enough to survive. You could spend 1 CP to make them harder to kill for 3 guys. I think that's very reasonable. And they have enough shooting and definitely enough combat to cause hassle, especially in lightly defended areas of the board like enemy zone or your own zone. And also being infantry, they allow you to get secondaries, line breaker, recon, like stuff like that. And so actually, I think that's a neat thing to think about doing. The Aquilon are less well-suited to this role. First of all, they have less utility and pile-in and movement shenanigans. Their bases are much larger, so it's harder to get deep striking space for them. And then they're just better as a big unit, so they can go punch stuff. So I think actually the Allarus work better in this semi kind of MSU form if people were trying that. And actually, I'd like to try like a more MSU style Custodes list. It seems like it's totally against what we want to try and do, but maybe we need to try these new things to see how they work out in ninth. And I wonder whether a MSU type list with smaller units and more units actually work more effectively than 4 big units. And actually, my latest list has the 11 units in it, so it's actually a much more MSU-y kind of list. Now, unfortunately for this, after saying all that, unfortunately now Venatari is just better than the Terminators at all the small unit stuff, and it's cheaper. You could probably get like 4 Venatari or even 5 Venatari. I had to do the math for a small unit of Terminators. They now have 2-up save and they shoot good. You certainly can superior fire patterns on just 3 or 4 guys. That still does a lot of damage. They don't hit as hard in combat, but they do enough for the kind of opposition that they're usually facing. And they are fly. They can ignore terrain, and they are infantry, and they move 12 inches. So they have actually way more movement threat. They can't just be spaced out. So actually, I think if you're going to do the MSU thing, you want small units, probably just running Venatari is better. There you go. Okay. Another idea that some people have is to run multiple units of Terminators. So running 2 units of Allarus. I've seen a lot of that, or running 1 Allarus, 1 Aquilon, perhaps having different roles. That's or hitting different types of targets. That's doable. And while I think that's perfectly fine because they're still some of our good units, you do run the risk of low mobility because although they're faster than other Terminators, they're still only 6-inch foot slogging guys, and so you do run a bit of mobility issue there. And sure, you can deep strike and use Homer and stuff like that, but then you're losing a lot of board presence, and now that's 50% of your army that's in deep strike. So you lose a lot by putting so much of your army in deep strike. So, and then the other issue with running multiple Terminator units is how do you split your CP expenditure? And a savvy opponent will make you split some there and some there, and so they'll make you AAA there and transhuman there and maybe grim there, and so now you're spending a lot of CP trying to keep 2 Terminator units alive, and you have no more CP for anything else. So that's the only big downside of doing 2 Terminator units is splitting your defensive efficiencies. Okay, so if we're talking in terms of scoring now in list building, I think I'm going to give this one to the Aquilons. I think right now the main function of Terminators is as a hammer unit, and Aquilons just hammer better. Allarus have some tricksy situational things that you can do, but if you take a 5 or 6 game GT, the number of times you can do some tricksy shit that actually has some impact, that you have the resources to do and the forethought and planning to pull off well, maybe 1 or 2 games out of 6, whereas a unit that just kicks some ass with their power fists is going to help you in 4 or 5 games out of 6. So I think it's just more useful to have a good hammer unit, invest in it. And then if you want the MSU more tricksy stuff, actually probably better just use Venatari right now. So, yeah. So I'm going to give that victory to the Aquilon Terminators. So, overall, the final score, Aquilon and Allarus, the final score was actually tied. 5-all in terms of points. This was not contrived. I wrote this whole thing and then I went back and added up the points and it ended up being a tie. That's interesting. That's also, to be honest, very fair. And so after having spent the last 2 days writing this episode and trying to trawl all the opinions across the Discord and the internet and videos and my own play experience, looking back at the rules, reading all the rules and strats and point values, they are pretty much tied. They are very similar units, very similar stats, have little bits of differences in their shooting and little combat ability differences. Some Venatari, the Allarus are better at some things. The Aquilon are better at other things. And, it really just depends on what you want from your Terminator unit. If you want just a unit that's going to come down and hammer the opponent, then the Aquilon is your unit. If you want a unit that is still going to do that pretty well, but have a little bit of flexibility in doing other things, then the Allarus is your unit. If you only have 100 points less to spend and you still want Terminators, then Allarus with spears. If you got all the points in the world and you want flat 3 damage, then Adrathic Aquilon. So there's a lot of flexibility now in the Terminators, more than it used to be, which was Allarus versus Lastrum Aquilon, and that decision now is basically a tie. But now you also have Spear Allarus and Adrathic Aquilon, which kind of makes the whole Terminator thing more flexible. I think my personal preference right now is Aquilon, because for what I want my Terminator unit to do, Aquilon do it better. But I can't tell people to not play Allarus. I think both units are really good at what they are trying to do. And so it's really just depending on what you want them to do, what else is in your list. So if you got no source of multi-damage, then maybe you're going to run Adrathic Aquilon. If you're running like 12 dick bikes, then you probably don't need Adrathic Aquilon. So it just depends on what else is in your list and what you're going to be playing. What's your meta? Are you playing Horde? Are you playing a lot of T3 Gravis? Are you playing Sisters? Like, that really determine which Terminator is better for you. In my local meta, for example, we still have a lot of people playing 3 or 4 Knight lists. And so Aquilon are my jam against Knights, right? Allarus just don't do it against Knights. And so in that kind of situation, I'm running Aquilon all the time for those Knight players. You go through a 6-round tournament, you're going to play at least one 4 Knight list. And so you need to be ready for that. So as I say, it's really a meta thing. Chris is always bringing Sisters. And so you need a lot of firepower for Sisters. It doesn't even matter what the AP is, because they probably ignore it, but you just need raw volume. So Lastrum, 40 shots from Aquilon is going to take out a lot of girls, right? Deep Blast from Ballistic Grenade Launcher is going to take out a lot of girls. So, these are all considerations you have to make based on your own decisions on what you're going to be playing against. Okay, my voice is going. Questions in the chat, guys. We're going to go to the Discord. So Sean will be doing Venatari. Maybe I'll do them next. I don't know. I was going to do bikes next, but I could do Venatari next if people prefer. Okay, let's go to the question channel. Okay, I answered most of these, but let's just go back. Okay. Pros and cons of split Termi versus mono Termi list. We got that. Assuming you come to a general answer, which Terminators you prefer. Yep. What type of characters does your meta need a lot to justify taking Allarus? We kind of hinted at that too. Only 5 points difference. How many points should Allarus cost in the Codex? I don't know. I would say if both our Terminator units came down another 5 points, that would be compelling. 10 points, I feel like they won't do that, but 5 points would definitely be compelling. Which one would be better to run a full army of? Neither. For either Terminators, do you consider running anything beyond the standard warrior options? Yes, we talked about that. Best way to move them, starting on the board or deep striking? I think you just do it on a game-by-game basis. You make a conscious decision. Don't just do it by routine. Adrathic or Stormbolters for Aquilons. Talked about that. Should the Aquilons have gained an extra toughness? We talked about that. What matchups specifically prefer Aquilon or Allarus? We kind of talked about that. Still worth running Aquilons with Stormbolters and Venataris with guns in the same list. So we kind of talked about that. If that's a consideration if you're going to be using superior fire patterns on Venatari. Also, is it worth running 2 times 10 Allarus and then unleashing them? So this was a very niche list that made its rounds maybe a couple months ago or a few months ago, running 20 Allarus Terminators and unleashing 1 unit the first turn and then the second unit the second turn, and then just flooding the board with lots of dudes. I feel like in a 6-game tournament, you will win 3 to 4 games like that and then lose horribly on 2 games. So it's probably not a GT winner, but it would be fun. All right, merit in bringing Allarus with spears, definitely. If you could create a new box set, which would be in it. There were some memes floating around when they announced those Christmas box sets that the Custodes box set would just be like one model. I don't know. I don't know what would be in the box set. Do we need Terminators in our list at all? No. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, you don't. A lot of people do like what the Terminators bring, but you definitely don't. In fact, our book is the best position has been right now forever in terms of so many things that are good. You play it how you want. So Devin loves to play his bikes. Doesn't run any Terminators. I still like having a Terminator unit. I'm going to be running a double Venatari soon. Some people are bringing the Dreads out now after the Forge World book. You know, there's a lot of ways to run Custodes right now, and they'll all do pretty well. So you don't need to run Terminators. Are Guardians with Shields able to replace Terminators? So I think Guardians with Shields are harder to kill than Terminators in some circumstances. If you have CP to spend, then Terminators are probably just as hard. And Terminators definitely hit harder than Shield Guard. I mean, Shield Guard with just the sword in terms of shooting and combat is not as good as Terminators. What do you want getting charged by Mortarion? Allarus or Aquilon? Neither. They will both die horribly. I mean, both are basically the same here. Turn off reroll, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Do you need to run Terminators at all? We kind of answered that. How many squads points should be Terminators? I've answered that. Flexibility, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we answered most of these questions. Okay, I think we answered more of those questions. Does preference change depending? Okay. Do running Terminators make you want to bring Trajan? I think, as we talked about, Trajan is a pretty compelling choice for any list. If you have a significant amount of foot troops, then Trajan makes even more sense because A, he can keep up, and they can screen for him, and also re-rolling ones when you're wounding everything on threes is really good. Are Aquilon and Allarus interchangeable? No. I hope we've made that clear tonight. Wouldn't Solar Watch with Sally 4th Warlord be worth taking if you play Terminator heavy list, if you want to deploy everything on the table? Sure, but you give up its opportunity cost, right? So you move an extra inch, you can rapid fire your spears or your Lastrum when you advance. Sure, that's good, but you give up, Grim Responsibility or Dread Host or whatever else you could have been playing. So, there's pros and cons to all the shield hosts. Comparing Marine Terminators and Custodes Terminators, do you think Custodes Terminators are costed fine, but Marine Terminators are undercosted? I think they need to meet in the middle. Let's just put it that way. I think it's more us need to come down than they need to go further up. Okay. Final question. Indigo Luke, if a list had a choice between 5 Aquilon with Lastrum plus Trajan versus 5 Aquilon with Adrathic plus a cheaper character, which do you take? Well, I'm going to answer that with the common answer, which is it depends. I think that is a real meta decision. Remember, Trajan brings you more than just, reroll ones. He gives you the CP and all that sort of stuff. So, I think that's a meta decision, whether you want Adrathic or not. Okay, guys, my voice is going to die. I'm going to sign off here. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks you for following, supporting. Thank you to our patrons and all our subscribers. And we'll see you guys tomorrow night for the podcast where they will be talking about what they feel or argue what they feel is the best unit in each faction. Okay, good night, everybody.